In this episode, Dr. Bill Randal and I discuss some of the tools for practicing narrative care and finding your own pathways to stillness. These tools help you to become more sensitive to seeing your own life as a story, and also to be a better story listener with others in your personal and professional life. For more resources on practicing narrative care, go to pathwaystostillness.org. Gary's book, Pathways to Stillness, is available at Amazon, Indigo, and Friesen Press.
A lot of the topics that we're speaking about here can be expanded, can be gone into in much more detail than we're able to talk about in this particular podcast. However, keep watching or keep listening, because some of these topics will be elaborated on at other times. But I've heard you tell this story, and if with your agreement, you could give an example of a signature story and also how stories change by talking about your iron lung story.
Oh, okay. Yeah, happy to. Let me just preface that by quotation from the novelist Alex Haley, who wrote the book Roots. He said in an interview once that every time an old person dies, it's like a library burns down. And I like to think that in the libraries of each of our lives, there are all kinds of stories. There's short stories, long stories, stories about the past, stories about the future, stories about ourselves alone, stories about other people, secret stories, stories we don't know how to tell. But then there's also a class of stories that you and I have described as signature stories. And by signature story, I mean a story that, and I think we all have our own pet collection of these. A signature story is a story that, basically we like to tell other people. Sometimes we tell these sorts of stories in hello, my name is situations, meeting somebody for the first time and just kind of getting to know each other. Out maybe will come one of our signature stories, because it's a story that conveys something to our listener that we want our listener to know about us, okay? So my iron lung story is kind of in that category. I'll tell it if I may, but there's a coda to it that I have to add as well. When I was 2 years of age, along with my two sisters, I came down with polio. And that was in the early 50s. And right here in the Maritime Provinces, there was an epidemic of polio that ran through many communities and families, sadly. So my older sister was permanently disabled. My next older sister almost died because she had polio of the trachea and just couldn't breathe. I had polio of the diaphragm, which is that muscular structure that enables us to breathe, helps our lungs to exhale and inhale and so forth. So for 2 weeks here in the city, as a matter of fact, I was placed in an iron lung in the St. John General Hospital. Not much of a story, really, but I do have this image of myself being in this contraption, kind of all by myself in this room, and I kind of envisioned that there were sort of bars on the windows, and outside was the fog of the city. And that's my story, okay? Not much of just an image, really, but I think I made that into a story, and I can recall hearing myself tell that little story about being in the iron lung to all kinds of people over the years, oftentimes at parties or in social situations where the conversation sometimes turns to life-threatening conditions that we've had and survived. So out would come my iron lung story. And people would invariably say, oh, wow, that must have been really difficult. My goodness, only 2 years of age. And I would kind of puff up my chest. Yeah, well, what are you going to do, sort of thing. But I toughed it out. So that story has had a cherished place, I guess, in my life and in my sense of identity over the years. It wasn't, though, until my late mid-40s that I was visiting my parents here in New Brunswick, having been living for a while in Toronto. And it was summertime, and I wanted to have a great, by the way, here comes the coda, okay? I was having a conversation with my parents at our cottage on Harvey Lake, and I really wanted to capitalize on the special little visit that I was having with my folks, and I wanted to convey to them how much I appreciated all the sacrifices that they made on behalf of me and my sisters, particularly during the polio epidemic. So I said, Mom and Dad, thanks so much, and must have been really difficult for you when I was in that iron lung for 2 weeks. Silence. Mother says, where did you get that idea? You were never in an iron lung. So anyway, we had this kind of somewhat comical conversation back and forth about whether or not I in fact was in an iron lung, and they basically convinced me that no, I was not. I did have some significant congestion, and in fact I contracted pneumonia and I was placed in an oxygen tent. But I'm thinking, I don't really like oxygen tent. That's not really as dramatic as an iron lung. I had to concede that they were right and I was wrong. And then I felt this surge of guilt that I should go back and try to set the record straight to all those people at all those parties that I had sort of told that I was an iron lung survivor. Anyway, so now I tell the story. It's a story about stories, if you will, and how the stories that oftentimes we pin parts of our identity to from perhaps early in life sometimes have questionable roots and sometimes are fake news, if you will, or are matters of faction more than fact. So that story, signature story, works differently for me now. But I think, as I say, we all have our pet collection of such stories, and it'd be interesting sometimes to make a list for ourselves of what those are for each of us, and then sort of delve more deeply into what's in that story.
It is an excellent example, perhaps, partly it's interesting anyway, comical. It has a comical side to it or ironic side to it. But I think it also speaks to your final point there, which was that perhaps we all walk around with stories that could be close to our identity. I'm not saying that one wasn't, that prevent us or block us from having a more joyful or free life, both in ourselves or with other people. So perhaps that's a good place to move into talking a little about the practical side of narrative gerontology. And we were talking before we started the podcast, that talking with Don as well, that with aging and changes that take place, we have to respond to those changes, and if we don't, then our lives can be quite difficult.